All right. Good morning and afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Taylor Lavelli, and I am the U.S. Advocacy Director at One Day Sooner. Today's webinar is co-hosted by One Day Sooner and our friends at the Federation of American Scientists. One Day Sooner is a philanthropically funded nonprofit that leads advocacy campaigns at the intersection of science, policy, and ethics in order to address the world's most harmful diseases. And the Federation of American Scientists, or FAS, is a nonprofit policy research and advocacy organization that brings scientific and technical expertise to bear on some of the nation's most complex challenges, including health security, national defense, and emerging technologies. So today for our webinar, we will be exploring opportunities for integrating artificial intelligence within the Department of Health and Human Services with the support of our two wonderful speakers. This conversation comes at a pivotal moment. And I'm sure many of you have seen that there has been significant momentum within the federal government on this topic, with the Food and Drug Administration recently announcing its adoption of an agency-wide large language model named ELSA. We've also seen the Office of Management and Budget is expected to release its government-wide AI action plan, and the National Institutes of Health is seeking comments on the creation of its first ever AI strategic plan. So with that, and against this backdrop, today we're going to explore how AI can be responsibly and effectively deployed to enhance public health, accelerate research, and support equitable access to care. So Dr. Liang Zhao is no longer able to join us today. So with that, we're thrilled to be joined today by our two distinguished speakers. First, we'll have Dr. Sandeep Patel, who is an independent consultant and entrepreneur with deep expertise in science, business, and global health security, having been the former director of BARDA's Drive at HHS. And then followed will be Dr. Jean-Paul Chrétien, who is the director of the Big If True Accelerator at Renaissance Philanthropy and served 20 years in the US Navy as a physician scientist, as well as working at DoD and DARPA. After our speakers present, we'll open the floor for audience Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the presentations using the Q&A chat function. And then just one final housekeeping note is that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants after the event. Before we turn to our guest speakers, we'd just like to start off with some brief framing remarks from both FAS and One Day Sooner on how each organization is thinking about AI in the context of HHS. And with that, I'll first turn to Clara Langevin from the Federation of American Scientists. Clara is an AI policy specialist on the emerging technology team at FAS. So with that, Clara, over to you.
Thanks, Taylor. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Clara Langevin from the Federation of American Scientists. We're thrilled to be co-hosting today's conversation on supporting AI capacity at the Department of Health and Human Services. Before we dive in, I wanted to start with a big thank you to our incredible speakers for sharing their time and expertise today, and to our partners at One Day Sooner, whose thought leadership and collaboration have helped shape the discussion we're about to have. So the Federation of American Scientists was founded nearly 80 years ago by scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project and felt a responsibility to shape the policy landscape that followed. That same sense of duty to ensure science and technology serves the greater good guides our work today. At FAS, we believe that bold ideas paired with the right people can drive meaningful change in government. And to do so, one of our major programs is the Day One Project, which helps elevate actionable science and technology policy ideas. We collaborate with a wide network of experts, including our friends at One Day Sooner, to bring polished, ready-to-implement proposals to decision makers. One of the more compelling examples is One Day Sooner's recent memo from Strategy to Impact, establishing an AI core to accelerate HHS transformation, which you'll hear more about in just a second. I think it embodies everything we value: smart policy design, deep technical insight, and a clear path to impact. I'm thrilled that today's conversation will build upon that and continue this important work. So we're asking our public institutions, especially agencies like HHS, to keep pace with one of the most transformative technologies in recent memory. But right now, we don't have all the infrastructure or people in place to do that effectively. According to a 2024 Biden administration report, over half of federal employees said that their agencies didn't have the right people in place to effectively use AI. And at the state level, only 38% of IT leaders said that they felt ready for AI. And yet, these are the same governments, often led or partnered with HHS, that are being asked to deploy, regulate, and steward AI in health, human services, and public benefit systems. If we want the public to trust AI applications in areas like health equity, biomedical research, pandemic preparedness, and benefits administration, then we need capable, trustworthy institutions behind them. At FAS, we're specifically interested in how we foster the talent ecosystem necessary to build public trust. And when we say AI talent, we mean more than just technical staff. We need data scientists and machine learning engineers and infrastructure leads, but we also need legal folks, privacy, civil rights experts to help identify and mitigate risks. And we also need folks who will build apart these diverse mission-driven AI teams to really ensure that however AI is used really has impact. Without this broader capacity, we can't responsibly integrate AI into public services, build the regulatory infrastructure for safe and ethical oversight, and foster the public sector innovation, research, and development that aligns U.S. leadership in AI with democratic values. This work remains critical regardless of the political landscape. Obviously, we're going through a time of uncertainty in the federal workforce, especially in important AI entities like the Department of Homeland Security's AI Corps. But we still have an obligation to keep pushing for programs like the program that Anli is about to present, fellowships, reskilling efforts, and partnerships that will grow our long-term capacity. At FAS, we're committed to supporting that broader ecosystem. We're excited to be in conversation today with others who share that commitment and who are building on the foundations of public trust, capability, and innovation on the AI era. So thank you all for being here again, and I'll pass it back to Taylor.
Great. Thank you, Clara. I'd now like to welcome Enthly Lewis, Regulatory Science and Policy Director at One Day Sooner. With that, Enthly, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. So as Taylor said, I'm here on behalf of One Day Sooner to talk about a proposal we developed in collaboration with FAS through their Day One project. In our memo, we propose the creation of an AI core, a team of technical AI experts embedded across the agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. So HHS oversees work in areas where AI is already proving valuable, like managing large healthcare datasets, improving clinical decision-making, and accelerating drug development. But so far, most of that progress has come from the private sector, which makes sense. Industry tends to move faster with new technologies than government does. In fact, federal agencies have historically struggled with tech implementation. One Standish Group report found that only 13% of federal software projects over $6 million succeed. But we think government can close that gap. And one key to doing so is bringing the right technical expertise into the public sector. As Taylor mentioned, there's been recent momentum within the federal government around AI, but it has naturally largely focused on strategy and setting direction. What we want to focus on now is execution, and execution depends on bringing talent into government. Now, while the federal workforce is full of highly skilled professionals, most don't have the deep technical expertise in AI. And without that expertise, integrating AI into core operations is a challenge, especially if it's added on top of already full plates. So the private sector has an edge here. It can recruit technical talent quickly and deploy them directly where needed. Government, on the other hand, often turns to consultants, and sometimes that's the right decision, but relying on external support can be a short-term fix. It rarely builds lasting capacity, and it doesn't drive the kind of cultural change needed for long-term success. An example that's worth remembering is the rollout of healthcare.gov, which was a vital public service that faltered because of fragmented oversight and a lack of in-house technical know-how. The consequences were pretty serious. People couldn't access care when they needed it most. And so you need in-house expertise if you want long-term success. And that's why we're proposing the creation of an AI core modeled in part after a similar effort at the Department of Homeland Security. It would begin as a small, high-impact team, about 10 technical experts placed within each of HHS's agencies. And the core members wouldn't be focused on policy or strategy, but on technical implementation, while working side by side with agency staff to identify and deliver AI-driven improvements. They'd also collaborate across agencies, sharing lessons learned, avoiding duplication, and accelerating progress through a community of practice. So to give you a better sense of what this could actually look like, let's go through potential placements for a core member. So the CDC's Data Modernization Initiative has already identified promising AI use cases. One involves using AI to forecast trends in opioid overdose mortality using mixed data sources like mortality records, prescription drug monitoring data, and real-time surveillance feeds. Another potential use case involves applying natural language processing methods on foodborne outbreak data to identify potential outbreak sources. So automating these tasks could shave days or weeks of current manual processes, or even enable the CDC to do analyses that just aren't feasible at the moment. An AI core member could be embedded at CDC to productionize the overdose forecasting model or to stand up the NLP pipeline within the foodborne disease outbreak surveillance system. Now, before I hand it back to Taylor, I would like to point out something important. HHS will adopt AI into its work streams, and in fact, it already has, with or without an AI core. Federal agencies always eventually adopt new technologies, just like they replaced fax machines with email and paper records with digital ones, mostly. The point isn't whether AI will be used, it's how well and how quickly. And in public health, speed and quality can make the difference between lives lost and lives saved. And so that's why we hope an AI core could achieve. And it's why we at One Day Sooner see this as an opportunity to save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Entley. Now we will go ahead and move into our speaker presentations. So first, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sandeep Patel to present on HHS on the front end of AI adoption with 4 specific case studies. Thanks, Sandeep.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Taylor. Thanks to One Day Sooner and FAS for organizing this. I think this is a super important and timely conversation, and super excited to be here with JP talking about this. So a couple sort of framing notes, I guess. One is I'm a physical scientist by background, not an AI expert. I did spend a decade inside HHS, both in the immediate office of the HHS secretary for 6 years, and then leading BARDA's innovation unit drive during the pandemic as part of the pandemic response, and overseeing kind of a large R&D funding operation there. So I'll sort of we'll talk about today, I think, will come from that perspective of sort of some mostly failing, sometimes succeeding in sort of bringing new initiatives to the department, and kind of my general familiarity with sort of how the department works and how it doesn't work in many different ways. So what I thought I would go through is sort of 4 examples where I think AI could have a pretty big impact in the department. But the way I sort of will frame this, I think, is a few notes. So one is, I think, for just about anything, but especially with AI, I think thoughtful deployment is really critical. dropping in a technology without thinking about how human AI or human sort of workflows happen or how they're impacted is a recipe for disaster. And we saw a lot of this in sort of the digitalization of government over the last couple decades, and so that's a really important note. I think that's sort of one. Two is that I think in general, what the sort of AI experts are at least sort of indicating or telling me is that we're in general kind of underestimating the impacts that AI is going to have, not just on the workplace and on organizations, but really how our economy and society are organized, right? And so given the pace of advancement, especially towards kind of artificial general intelligence, I think it's really important to note that the way we should think about deployment is not, how to take current state technology and apply it to the department, but kind of anticipating where things are going to go, especially when you think about slower deployment kind of timelines. So that I think that's important. The other point is that I think there's a bunch of obvious and important uses of AI that are already happening or people are already kind of thinking about. I think I'm not going to cover those in kind of the sort of examples that are run through. I think they're really important and they should happen, but I think they're already happening and people are already thinking about them. So the other thing to point out too is that in general, I think people who aren't familiar with federal agencies like HHS tend to underestimate the level of human expertise that's already embedded within the department. Of course, there's like areas missing, AI expertise, as Emily pointed out. But in general, there's a deep well of expertise there, I think, and then people tend to underappreciate just how bad processes are in government and how much they really impede smart, talented people from delivering to their capabilities. So with all those sort of points in mind, let's talk about a couple examples. I'll sort of run through 4 examples. One is, how AI could help modernize the research and development funding apparatus is sort of one. Two is, how AI can help kind of unlock the ocean of data that's currently at the FDA. Three is how AI could be really important in reversing institutional knowledge loss in a large organization like HHS. And then, fourth, if we have time for it, wanted to hit on how AI could impact really important regulatory processes like CMS's payment payment rulemaking kind of processes. So on the first point, modernizing research and development funding apparatus. Important to note, scientific research and development is really the lifeblood of our economy, right? And largely, we sort of created the system that we have today in the middle of the 20th century. Fueled a wave of innovation that affects, pretty much our entire lives in many different ways. But that funding kind of system never really modernized. At the same time, we saw kind of the modernization of sort of financial markets to make them very frictionless and easy to access and have efficient allocation systems. But we haven't seen the same effects in the way we fund science. And the system we have today is really high friction, low transparency, and low throughput. So, an example of sort of high friction is that, if you're an investigator applying for proposals, you're spending, 30 to 40% of your time just applying for grants. And not even applying for grants, but like recycling the same proposals, right, to fit the specific bespoke formats of a variety of different funders. You have to experience slow decision time making, in terms of hearing back on those proposals. We have a low transparency system that, has very opaque kind of review processes. They're often embroiled in kind of community scientific politics and things like that. You don't often have a lot of feedback that goes back to sort of proposers to really improve kind of the process overall. You have a low throughput system as well, right, where you have very siloed systems of funding, one-off evaluation systems. Again, if you're an investigator writing a proposal, you'll hear back in a separate process. A funder will engage, have a review process on that particular proposal that might be a response to an RFP. And you might be getting the same kind of process from a different funder on the same proposal, right? So you have a lot of processes that currently don't scale or transfer across different funders. So I think the sort of opportunity, well, let me hit on the couple more problems on this front. I think there's a bunch of inefficiencies that sort of go along with this. kind of system. I think we talked about redundancy. At the same time, there's a number of funders of science out there that don't have the infrastructure that the NIH, for example, does. And can't bet and doesn't have the ability to both solicit proposals in the same way or doesn't have the infrastructure to review them. And so you have all of these sort of like individual decision-making things happen, and you have this system where you have a lot of philanthropic dollars kind of sitting on the sidelines. And so I think the opportunity for AI here, there's a few different ones, right? So, NIH being the largest biomedical research funder in the world, has somewhere in the order of a, $40 to $50 billion budget, is an enormous player, right, in this system. And so, but if you sort of go back to kind of thinking about some of the functions that NIH has, it's both a funder of research, but it's also has a unique ability to convene a bunch of experts and really has, the ability to highlight things that are important areas of science to fund. But it doesn't really take advantage of that, right? So, on the one hand, you have a number of proposals that come into NIH that, fall below the pay line, that are, rated highly, but maybe, aren't fit for funding, that no other funder can benefit from currently, right? So there's a huge opportunity there for AI to sort of think about better ways to do matching to other funders, to take the same infrastructure that NIH has already put into reviewing a proposal and enabling other funders to kind of take advantage of that. I think there's even within NIH you see the sort of phenomena where often an investigator will write multiple proposals within different RFP or responding to different RFPs within NIH or across different federal agencies. And so again, there's a huge opportunity, I think, to think about one, standardization of those things, right? So you can imagine kind of a common app version of a proposal. And AI right now, to this in the current state is very good at kind of reformatting information. And so there's an immediate efficiency that can be gained from kind of developing a common standard that multiple funders can kind of apply on. The other sort of aspect of this is thinking about kind of enabling portable networked reviews. So, you can imagine a system where kind of peer reviews travel with the proposal across different agencies and different funders. And then you can sort of turn on AI systems to triage really clear kind of yes or no decisions, and then spend the bulk of your effort on the really important part in the middle, right there, as well as all the sort of matching to all the different federal agencies kind of putting RFPs out. So anyways, there's a huge sort of, I think, opportunity to completely kind of rethink how we allocate research funding. And AI tools today are sort of perfectly positioned for that. Obviously, this is going to require really thoughtful deployment on, how do you take the expertise that already exists within NIH or BARDA or ARPA-H, right? Those are the major funders within HHS, and kind of take advantage of those experts and have sort of AI enable the system to be sort of more efficient. So that's sort of example one, and happy to sort of talk more about that in Q&A. Number two is kind of unlocking FDA's what I would call their sort of hidden data ocean. So AI models and especially LLMs have enormous potential to reshape clinical development pathways. But they're really only as good as the data that they're trained on. And as was referenced earlier, FDA has their sort of internal LLM that they've created, which I won't comment on here. But what I do want to hit on is, FDA has, in its treasure troves right now, the most valuable biomedical data sets in the world. And they're largely locked away. And so most of this information are things like, preclinical data, manufacturing protocols, clinical study reports, all the regulatory filings that sort of occur, and that FDA has both things that have succeeded and also things that have failed. And important to note that this isn't necessarily patient data. This is scientific data. This is already anonymized, and there are sort of mechanisms that it can be shared quite safely without compromising privacy. The problem, though, is that, when drug sponsors go bankrupt, which they often do, right? So I think over 25% of NASDAQ listed biotech companies today have valuations that are, below their sort of cash on hand, which basically means they're very vulnerable to going bankrupt. That's a huge loss of data when those companies go private. And the FDA has access to a lot of that biomedical data. And this is biomedical data that is extremely useful to, future developers and sponsors, right? Oftentimes they're starting from scratch because they don't have the access to the data that shows them where certain trials have failed and where they could succeed where others, haven't. And we haven't largely sort of taken advantage of that. Larger pharma companies do have a lot of data on stuff that they've already filed themselves, or sort of from smaller firms that they've acquired, which also sort of gives them an advantage over their smaller biotech. So, there's a huge opportunity to think about deployment of this data to the community that could both aid and accelerate the sort of drug development industry in the U.S. In a really meaningful way that we haven't done to date. So that's sort of idea number two. Again, happy to talk about that more in detail as well. The third is, this is now thinking a little more internally in the department. So HHS is a fairly large department. 70,000 plus employees. Obviously, that's changing quite a bit over the last couple of months, but it's a fairly large organization. And one thing that government typically does not do well is to take advantage of kind of institutional knowledge and avoid institutional knowledge loss, especially as people rotate or leave government service or, and often when they leave, all the institutional knowledge that they've built over the years and decades that they've worked in their roles is just lost, right? And as new people come in, you see this phenomenon where it takes them a very long time to ramp up and to understand kind of both their role. But more importantly, there's just a trove of information and insights and ideas that these sort of people have, things that they've tried and failed, and many other kind of like very nuanced insights about how things work in the department that are just lost. And so again, this is where AI, there are immediate opportunities to both sort of mine data, that's embedded in emails and other kind of sources of information to actually glean insights into sort of past initiatives that have been tried, and figure out sort of what's worked and what hasn't worked. I think this sort of speaks to a much sort of larger initiative over time to think about, how do we reorient communication across the department? I would say in my experience in government, one of the biggest areas of friction was sort of collaboration, right? Figuring out when to collaborate, with whom to collaborate, when not to collaborate. And these are issues that, every large organization faces, but I think they're particularly pronounced in a place like HHS. And so thinking about how AI could actually enable collaboration more effectively, to sort of hold information and to be a source of insights for people that don't have the experience, it is a huge opportunity to make the entire department more efficient. So that's sort of idea number three. The fourth example that I sort of want to run through, and I'll be super brief on this one, is that CMS, the Center for Medicare, Medicaid Services, is arguably the most influential organization in the healthcare industry in the U.S. Shapes over $1.6 trillion in sort of healthcare incentives as an insurer. And it's a process that's largely opaque to most people who are not kind of insiders into the process. They have a number of these sort of rulemaking kind of cycles that they go through annually to adjust payment incentives, both for physicians and other clinicians, but also to providers and other sort of hospital systems for a variety of services. And these have enormous influence on the entire healthcare industry, including other payers. The process by which this happens is again fairly opaque. They do put out regular rulemaking, public sort of facing rulemaking processes, that are open and transparent in theory, but in practice, these are things that are, only responded to by large organizations. I think over 70% of responses to sort of proposed rules at CMS come from industry groups. I think fewer than 10% of those responses, or those sort of responses get responses back from CMS as to how they influence sort of decision making. So I think there's a huge opportunity for AI both to sort of widen the participation of insights from a variety of stakeholders in the healthcare industry on sort of how payments can happen, but it also sort of has the unique opportunity to make these cycles run faster. Often takes many, many months to run through kind of a payment cycle, and it takes enormous resources. And this is where information data is quite heavy, and so it takes time to kind of like run through all of the massive amounts of text that go through this. And so there's immediate opportunities to sort of utilize AI to both, yeah, make this more democratic, more transparent, and kind of more real time in the system. So anyway, I'll pause there, and happy to take any questions in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep, for outlining those 4 case studies so well. I see the questions piling up in the Q&A, so keep them coming. But with that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Jean-Paul Chrétien for our second presentation on AI-driven projects and research areas with high impact potential for HHS.
Well, thank you, Taylor, and thanks to One Day Sooner and FAS for this really timely webinar. I very much appreciate the chance to be part of this. It's an honor to join my friend Sandeep on the panel. Unlike Sandeep, I do not come from HHS. I spent most of my career in DoD, and that did involve a lot of collaborations over the years with HHS and various components. But I'm not an HHS insider. I have seen enough through those collaborations to appreciate Sandeep's point that there's a tremendous amount of expertise and capability across the department. So anything I say by way of suggestions or ideas comes from a place of deep respect and gratitude for the HHS workforce, many wonderful colleagues and friends in that community. Now I work at a nonprofit, at a philanthropic organization that focuses on science and technology and innovation, Renaissance philanthropy, and that is really coloring my thoughts on this topic. And one of the things that I'm really excited about in thinking about opportunities for HHS at the intersection of AI and health is the partnership, the public-private partnership. So thinking about what can be accomplished if HHS brings its unique capabilities and resources and expertise, and the private sector does the same. Sandeep had a really nice example of that, like with FDA's biomedical data holdings. What if those could be opened up more broadly? And most of my comments are going to be along those lines. So there already is a lot of very good work going on across HHS, both intramural and extramural, at the intersection of health and AI. And so instead of trying to think of specific projects that might be undertaken, I'll try to pull it up a level and think about categories of activities that might be especially impactful and high leverage for the department. And I'm thinking about leverage in a couple of ways. First, getting back to this idea of public-private partnerships, what are the things that private sector, for-profit and nonprofit, philanthropic organizations and others, what are the things that they might do a lot of on their own and bring a lot to the table so that the federal government is not having to pull all of the weight here? So I think we can identify a number of activities where where the private sector would be very willing to join in these collaborations and commit a lot of their own resources. And I'll share some examples of that. So that's one point of leverage. And then the other thing is especially interested in activities that are cross-cutting across many different diseases and areas of health. So so that's what I'll try to focus on and offer a few examples of directions that HHS might consider, again, at the intersection of AI and health. The first one is generating data for AI model training from HHS owned or supported resources. So, one of the challenges that we have in applying AI in biomedicine is that we don't have anywhere near the amount of data that models like ChatGPT have been trained on. And so, this can make it challenging to try to understand the language of biology and health with AI. But we have the opportunity to generate those data because HHS has already invested in resources like epidemiological cohorts and biological specimen repositories that can help get us there. And what is especially important about resources like that is that they are connected to the data that we could generate from those resources are connected with the downstream outcomes that we actually care about, like development of disease and the aging process. So efforts like the All of Us study out of NIH, which recruits people and then follows them over many years. These are especially impactful for identifying early indications of disease, and then most importantly, developing new strategies for intervention. But it takes patience and a long-term view. One of the best examples in the world of this is the UK Biobank, which I think we could learn a lot from. This was stood up by the UK government and philanthropies more than 20 years ago, enrolled 500,000 people and records a lot of data as they go through their lives, data from the healthcare system, including imaging data, genotype data, proteomics, medical imaging data, periodic questionnaires. And when people were enrolled in that study, they were in their 40s at the younger end. And so for the first few years of that effort, not much was learned from the UK Biobank. But now that this is a mature cohort, it's one of the most valuable resources in the world for understanding development of diseases that we care a lot about from a public health and disease burden perspective, and developing new ideas for intervention. So last year alone, there were 5,000 peer-reviewed publications on data from the UK Biobank, so in just 1 year. And the reason that's possible is that the data that's generated in that population, that is made available to any researcher anywhere in the world in a safe and secure and privacy preserving way. And to our other point about leverage and public-private partnerships, it's not the UK government that's footing the bill for all this. In fact, some of the most interesting analytical work happening on the specimens from the UK Biobank are supported by industry and philanthropy. So some of the folks at our organization, Renaissance Philanthropy, were able to organize a coalition of funders, raised tens of millions of dollars for those assays and imaging data that the UK government then matched. And studies like All of Us that are happening at HHS, I think, could be similarly impactful over time. All of Us in particular is complementary, is having a much more diverse cohort and is able to take advantage of new analytical techniques that are coming online. But more generally, there are resources and cohorts that are supported across HHS agencies that also could provide great opportunities for generating data that could be used for AI model training. And I think it'd be worthwhile to systematically look at what those resources are and figure out how we could open them up to folks outside the government to maximize the utility of those resources. So that's one thought on data generation. Another thought is in sifting through all those data to identify those early markers of disease and health, those precedent biomarkers, which might be genetic or epigenetic or metabolomic or wearable sensors or imaging data. It could really be anything. And AI certainly is going to be helpful in figuring out what those are. This is also another fantastic opportunity for partnerships with the private sector, because philanthropy and industry in particular cares a lot about biomarkers, especially if they can be used in clinical trials. So, all of this AI-fueled early stage discovery from AlphaFold and other AI bio platforms, this is all wonderful, but it's all going to run up against a bottleneck at the clinical trial stage. Clinical trial is the final common pathway for all of this if we want these things to get to patients. And it's going to end up being a bottleneck unless we can figure out how to make clinical trials run faster and cheaper and more successfully. And here's where biomarkers can come in, because if you've got a quantitative biomarker that predicts the clinical outcome that you're actually interested in years down the road, and you're able to validate that biomarker and get the FDA approval to use that as clinical trial endpoint, well, then you can shave years and many millions of dollars off clinical trials. And the potential value from that is enormous. It's a lot more than I had realized. There's an economist at Dartmouth, Heidi Williams, who's looked at this, and she and her colleagues have calculated that the potential value from more comprehensive use of biomarkers across clinical trials is in the trillions of dollars. And that is from running clinical trials faster, from getting treatments approved more quickly, and ultimately saving hundreds of thousands of life years every year. And that's for cancer alone. There's one specific effort that I think is worth noting here. It's called the Biomarker Consortium, and it's coordinated by the foundation of NIH, and includes a number of HHS agencies like NIH and FDA. And for more than 20 years, it's been trying to develop biomarkers and trying to get them validated and approved, and has had a number of very significant successes there. That effort is funded by industry, because at a pre-competitive stage, because industry has an interest in these biomarkers being developed. So, thinking about how to enhance efforts like that in the age of AI, how to bring more philanthropic funding into that for biomarkers and clinical conditions that maybe are not as attractive to industry, that seems like another potential high leverage activity. And then the last thing that I'll mention is standards. When you look at the some of the most interesting advanced the platforms for generating biodata that could be used in AI models, like immunological data, some types of imaging data, what you often find is that there are different companies making different platforms, and the data from those different platforms, even though they purport to be measuring the same thing, those data often aren't comparable. And this is a challenge for developing AI models and bringing them into clinical practice, especially if you're tracking something over time, like a biomarker in a patient, and that patient has that biomarker measured by different platforms at different times, and you don't know whether the difference the measurement reflects an actual biological difference or a methodological difference. There's an effort here that I want to call out as well, because I think it could be a model for how we might go about standards in other areas in order to make data more useful for AI. And this is a consortium that's focusing on MRI imaging, quantitative MRI. This is a quantitative imaging technique. And so in theory, this lends itself very well to AI, and AI could be assisting radiologists in making readings of these images. But you can't always do that because there are different MRI devices, different protocols, and you can't compare images that are run on different machines. So if a patient has an image taken in one place and then they move, or they end up in the emergency department, well, you often can't compare those two images. So there's this consortium that's formed with government, HHS agencies, NIST and others, and industry groups and academia that are trying to develop standards for MRI imaging so that we can actually take advantage of AI and ultimately have that capability delivered to patients. And in fact, this group has a nice white paper on what they've been able to accomplish so far. It's on the FAS website, part of the Day One project. Quantitative MRI imaging, precision health is the title of the working paper. And so in efforts like that could be a model for other consortia that might develop around other types of data. AI needs standards, and HHS is uniquely positioned, spanning early stage discovery to regulatory approval, uniquely positioned to bring all the parties together and start working towards those standards that we need to take advantage of AI. So I'll pause there. Just three examples from one perspective. Data generation from HHS resources, biomarkers, standards. I'd love to hear what other folks think. I do think it'd be useful to think about this in a more systematic and comprehensive way. So my last suggestion would be that HHS do this and figure out what we mean by high leverage AI activities across the department, and then systematically look at opportunities and prioritize opportunities for doing that, and thinking about what can we leverage from the private sector in order to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, JP, and thank you to both of our speakers for your insights and thought leadership today. So with that, I think we can now turn to audience Q&A, and I'll hand things over to Corinna, who will read some of the questions submitted in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. Hi, everybody. Corinna Gerhardt, manager at FAS on our emerging tech and AI team. And we got some great questions in the chat, and also encourage you to keep sending them in. Let's start off with one of the, I think a good general question to start off with, which is, how can HHS best leverage AI through both internal development and through partnering with private companies? And the commenter mentions that ELSA is outdated, error prone, and lags current versions of leading models. So curious if you guys have any thoughts about this.
Do you want to take it, JP? I can do a crack at it. I think JP hit on a couple of these things earlier, which is, I think one is that, well, just to tie a few things together, I think one is that I think at minimum you need some level of deep AI expertise in the federal agencies themselves, because you need the ability to sort of understand what the requirements are and how technology could be, thoughtfully and effectively deployed, right? And so without that, I think it's really hard to do that. I think thinking about public-private partnerships as much as possible, to me, makes the most sense, rather than trying to recreate what a private company is doing internally, which you could sort of fall behind. It's enormous resource requirements, et cetera, that, there are thoughtful ways to sort of create these sort of public-private partnerships. But again, I think in order to do that effectively, you need the experts at the federal agencies at minimum to sort of think about what the right partnerships look like.
Yeah, strong agree on that, and this goes back to the idea of a core AI team within the department or within its agencies. You really need that, whether it's for internal development or adoption of industry tools, and for forming these public-private partnerships, to have an understanding of what the what the opportunities are. But I think those partnerships really, really are key. HHS thinking about what its unique assets are, so the legislative and regulatory authority, it's a convening authority, and it has tremendous resources. Sandeep and I both touched on some of those that could be opened up to broader communities, and I think that's where real opportunity is for AI development is industry expertise, private sector expertise on the AI side with the tremendous resources that HHS has.
Excellent. Thank you. Now we have a follow-up question here for Sandeep. So for unlocking data at FDA, do you envision external stakeholders querying this data to support their own protocol development, or to be exclusively available to FDA employees to support their application review?
Well, I think currently FDA employees do have access to a lot of this data. What I was sort of referring to was to open, again, thoughtfully, in the right way, but open it up to the community of developers out there. This is a big sticking point with development of new drugs and other sort of medical products, is that oftentimes people are starting somewhat blind, right? The public data out there on sort of trials and protocols and all this kind of stuff is quite limited. And so, to me, the example is, with patents, right? The one of the ways patent systems work effectively is that in exchange for disclosing publicly your invention, right, you get some sort of exclusivity. The problem with applying that to clinical development is that most of the valuable information is actually in the regulatory filings, in the clinical data, not in the patent. And so, thinking about thoughtful ways, especially for bankrupt companies or failed assets, right, to make that data available to others, so we were not making the same mistake, again and again.
That's great. Thanks. Here's another question for both of you guys. So what are your thoughts on leveraging AI at HHS, which, partially already covered, but this commenter is interested in the specific pathways for cures for rare diseases, and if there's anything unique about rare diseases that make them a better fit for leveraging AI than other more common diseases.
I can offer a couple of thoughts on that. I think it's a fantastic question. This is an especially difficult space because it's not always attractive to industry. You're thinking about developing a cure that might benefit a few hundred, a few thousand people. And so, what we often have in the space, unfortunately, is some very excellent basic science research that happens in universities, and then we see a failure to commercialize that. So, some things that might be useful there for AI is figuring out how we can leverage data and lessons across all of these individual efforts. So we see some excellent science and some patient driven groups that each of which is laser focused on a particular condition. So how can we tie all that together and harness those learnings and that energy and find commonalities in order to overcome this problem of going for a very small market. We've already seen some great applications of AI in repurposing drugs for rare diseases, drugs that already exist, and applying AI to what we know about the pathways of how they work and what we know about diseases. So some great efforts around there. And I also think there are some novel regulatory techniques that at least have been under consideration at FDA as well to kind of lower the bar to get these treatments out. But yeah, those are a few thoughts. I think it's a really important question. Yeah.
Yeah, super. I agree with JP on all that. I think that in addition to that, the way I think about rare diseases is that while obviously individual rare diseases are rare, and ultra rare diseases are ultra rare, that in aggregate there are many of them, right? And so I think we quickly run into sort of bottlenecks of, do we have enough bench scientists running through all of the hypotheses at an early, research sort of stage, and then, further into clinical development, do we have all the resources to like actually run through, all of the different rare disease kind of therapeutic pipeline, right? And so I think this is where AI, to the extent that it could, lower the cost, lower the sort of reliance on large intensive kind of research projects. Like if we can shave those off to some extent, you could take more shots, on goal for a bunch of different rare diseases. So I think this is where kind of like systematic efficiencies can really help.
That's great. I think we have one more question lined up from the audience, and I can ask a couple of other questions from our team to round us out unless other folks want to submit. But this commenter is wondering how the NIH specifically can use AI to improve funding decisions or to, I believe, streamline those processes. If you all have thoughts.
Yeah, I guess as a comment a little bit on my sort of point. I think there's a couple things. One is that, if you look at the sort of traditional peer review kind of process, right, it's about sort of finding a few experts in a particular domain, kind of bringing them together and having them kind of run through and read, a number of different proposals in their sort of area of expertise, and then, figuring out sort of what should be funded and what shouldn't be funded. And I think that while that model is has a lot of merit to it, I think it doesn't scale very much, and I think it runs into a bunch of different problems. I think one is that oftentimes you need more experts, right, to weigh in on different aspects of a proposal, especially in our sort of highly interdisciplinary world right now. And so, thinking about how AI can actually not replace humans, but to be a conduit for a wider range of human expertise to weigh in, I think is a really important opportunity. So sort of accessing more experts is sort of one. I think, two is that there are ways that AI can sort of do the easy stuff, right? There's a lot of objective kind of metrics and sort of characterizations of proposals and of scientific research that I think AI can do exceptionally well, and that you can allow humans to then sort of weigh in on the really hard questions in terms of sort of what has merit and what hasn't. And I think that's both a better use of people's time, right? So that takes really important scientists and gives them back a lot of time that they have. But also, creates a little more objectivity around sort of how decisions are made, right? I think the other thing AI can do, and this is more of a meta science point, is that, if sort of done well, I think it allows for more experimentation in funding. I think this is a really important point. We don't do enough experiments in how we fund science at a reasonable scale, and I think thinking about designing kind of AI agents and systems to sort of allow that, and actually for us to learn more about how, different funding decisions like actually impact the sort of downstream sort of impacts of those decisions is really important.
And I would emphasize, I agree with all that and emphasize that last point. There are opportunities here to understand what works better. And we haven't approached this with an experimentation mindset before. So running experiments, doing this in a systematic way, establishing this as a research agenda, I think would be, AI enabled, I think would be a worthy pursuit. Yeah.
That's such a good point, and I think a really good point to end on as well. With that, I will pass it back to Taylor, and thank you so much to both of you for your insights.
Right. And as we wrap up, I just want to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially our speakers for sharing their fascinating insights. The responsible integration of AI into health systems presents both tremendous promise and important challenges, and conversations like these are critical to ensuring these perspectives. We'll share a recording of today's session along with relevant resources, including the Day 1 memo. And if you have any additional questions or would like to connect further, please don't hesitate to reach out to us or our partners at FAS. So thank you again. We hope to see you at future events, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.